Story number 1.
The Man in the Corner. It started when I moved into my first apartment. I was fresh out of college, broke, and desperate for a place to live, so when I found a one-bedroom unit at half the usual rent, I jumped on it. The landlord was eager to hand over the keys, barely explaining the quirks of the place. "It's an old building," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It makes noise sometimes. Don't let it bother you." I thought he was talking about creaky floors or leaky pipes. I wish that had been the case. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, set up my bed, and tried to ignore the slightly musty smell that seemed to cling to the walls. But on the second night, I noticed it. The feeling of being watched. At first, I chalked it up to nerves, new place, new sounds, unfamiliar shadows. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was in the room with me. I glanced around, my eyes adjusting to the dark. That's when I saw him. A man, sitting in the corner of my bedroom. He wasn't moving. He just sat there, hunched over with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. I could only make out his outline in the dim light, but there was something off about him. His limbs were too long and his head seemed slightly tilted, like it was too heavy for his neck. I froze, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I whispered. No response. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, turning on the flashlight. The beam swept over the corner, but it was empty. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But I started noticing small things. Doors left ajar that I was sure I'd closed. Items moved to places I hadn't put them. The worst part was the corner. I couldn't stop looking at it. Every time I walked into my bedroom, my eyes were drawn to that spot. It felt colder there, like the air didn't move right. One night I decided to test it. I put a chair in the corner, facing the wall, and left the room. When I came back, the chair was turned around, facing the bed. The dreams started after that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, with the man in the corner staring at me. His eyes were dark pits, his face pale and waxy like melted candle wax. He didn't speak, but I could feel his thoughts pressing against my skull. Heavy, invasive, like something trying to crawl inside. When I finally regained control of my body, the corner would always be empty. I tried everything to get rid of him. I saged the apartment, hung mirrors, even slept with the lights on. Nothing worked. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my phone and started recording, determined to prove to myself that there was nothing there. I set the camera on my nightstand, aimed at the corner, and hit record before turning out the lights. I didn't sleep, but I kept my eyes shut, pretending to. The next morning, I watched the footage. For hours, the corner was empty, just as I'd hoped. But at 3:27 a.m., the screen flickered. The man appeared, slowly taking shape in the corner. He didn't walk in. He just emerged, like he'd been pulled from the shadows. He stood there for a while, watching me. Then, without moving his legs, he began to drift toward the bed. The video ended with him standing over me, his face inches from the camera, his empty eyes staring directly into the lens. I moved out that same day, breaking my lease and leaving most of my belongings behind. The landlord didn't ask for an explanation. He just sighed and said, "You're not the first." Now, every time I walk into a new room, my eyes are drawn to the corners. And sometimes, just for a second, I swear I see him there.
Story number 2.
The shadow in the mirror. When I was 16, my parents bought a house that came with a history. It was a Victorian-era relic, complete with creaky stairs, stained glass windows, and a massive antique mirror mounted in the upstairs hallway. The mirror was strange. Its frame was carved from dark, almost black wood, with intricate patterns that seemed to twist and shift the longer you looked at them. My mom loved it, calling it a piece of history. But I hated it from the start. The glass always seemed too dark, like it held onto shadows even in the brightest light. And no matter how often I cleaned it, smudges and streaks would appear the next day, like fingerprints pressed from the inside. The first time I noticed something unusual, I was walking past it late at night. It was a habit of mine to grab a glass of water before bed, and the hallway light was off. leaving the mirror in near darkness. As I passed, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the surface. I froze, my heart pounding. Turning back, I stared into the mirror. At first, it reflected the hallway behind me, empty and still. But then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the glass. It didn't look like me. It was taller, its limbs too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to pull at me. I turned on the hallway light and it was gone. I convinced myself it was a trick of the dark, but after that, I started avoiding the mirror. I'd rush past it without looking, refusing to acknowledge the faint pull I felt whenever I was near it. My little sister Lily didn't seem bothered by it. She even liked to stand in front of it making faces or pretending she was a princess. "Do you see her too?" she asked me one afternoon. "See who?" I asked, my stomach dropping. "The lady in the mirror," she said casually. "She looks funny, doesn't she? Like she's too blurry." I grabbed her by the shoulders. "Lily, if you see anyone in the mirror, don't talk to them. Do you understand?" She just giggled and ran off like I was being silly. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt louder. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Just as I was drifting off, I heard Lily's voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, coming from the hallway. At first I thought she was talking to herself, but then I realized she was responding, pausing between words, as if someone was speaking to her. I got up, my chest tight with dread, and stepped into the hallway. Lily was standing in front of the mirror, her hand pressed against the glass. Her reflection stared back, but something wasn't right. The reflection's eyes were wrong. Too dark, too hollow. "Lily," I said, my voice trembling. "What are you doing?" "She wants to come out," Lily said without turning around. My blood ran cold. "Who wants to come out?" "The lady in the mirror," she said. "She says she's lonely." I rushed forward and grabbed her, pulling her away from the mirror. The moment I touched her, the glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. The shadow in the reflection didn't fade. Instead, it pressed closer, its hands flattening against the inside of the glass. I could hear faint whispers now, a voice that wasn't Lily's, low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. I threw a blanket over the mirror and dragged Lily back to her room. She was crying, saying I'd scared the lady, but I didn't care. That night I locked my bedroom door and slept with the lights on. The next morning, the mirror was cracked. A single jagged line ran from one corner to the other, and the glass beneath the blanket was smeared with handprints. My mom was furious, saying I must have done it, but I didn't care. I begged her to get rid of the mirror, to throw it out or sell it, but she refused. "It's a family heirloom," she said. "It stays." I didn't argue. I knew it wouldn't matter. The mirror didn't want to leave. A week later, we found Lily in front of it again, her eyes glazed over, her hand pressed against the glass. This time, her reflection didn't match her movements. While she stood perfectly still, the shadow behind the glass raised a hand and smiled. That was the last night we stayed in that house. We packed our things and left, leaving the mirror behind. But sometimes, even now, I catch glimpses of it in my dreams, and every time I wake up, I feel like something is watching me from the corners of the room.
Story number 3.
The phone call. It was late, close to midnight, when my phone rang. At first I didn't recognize the number. It wasn't saved in my contacts, and there was no name displayed, just a string of digits I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something about the persistent ringing made me answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice groggy. For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then, a faint crackling static. "Who is this?" I asked, more annoyed now. A voice finally came through, low and trembling. "Help me." It sounded like a woman, but the static distorted her words, making her voice waver like a bad radio signal. "Who is this?" I asked again, sitting up in bed. "They're coming," she whispered. "What? Who's coming?" Before she could answer, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, unsure what to do. It had to be a prank, right? Some random caller trying to freak me out. I told myself to ignore it and went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept under my skin. The next night, the phone rang again. Same number, same timing. This time I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me, and I played the message as soon as it came through. Her voice was clearer now, more desperate. "They're here, please. You have to stop them." In the background I could hear something else. Faint thuds like heavy footsteps, and a sound that reminded me of breathing, low and guttural. I deleted the message and blocked the number. I didn't want to deal with whatever this was, but that was a mistake. The next day, I started noticing strange things. My phone would buzz with notifications that disappeared before I could read them. My call history showed missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, even though my phone had never rung. That night the call came through again, this time from a different number. I didn't answer, but the voicemail it left sent chills down my spine. "They know where you are now," the woman said. "It's too late." I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the house made me jump. Every shadow felt too long, too dark. Around 3 a.m., I heard a knock at my front door. It was soft at first, almost tentative. Then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. I crept to the door, my heart pounding, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. But as I turned away, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Why won't you let us in?" Panic set in. I called the police, telling them someone was trying to break into my house, but by the time they arrived, everything was quiet. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. They told me to call back if it happened again, but I could tell they didn't believe me. That night, I slept with every light on, clutching a baseball bat. The calls didn't stop. Every night, the same pattern. Static, whispers, the woman's voice pleading for help. One night, I worked up the nerve to answer again. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. The voice on the other end didn't answer at first. Then in a voice so faint I could barely hear it, she said, "They're already inside." The line went dead. And then I heard it. A faint creak coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, my grip tightening on the bat as the sound grew louder. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving closer. I didn't wait to see what it was. I threw open my window and climbed out, running barefoot into the street. When I finally looked back, my bedroom light was flickering and a dark figure stood silhouetted in the window watching me. I never went back to that house. The calls stopped after I moved, but sometimes late at night I still hear the faint sound of static in the distance. And I know deep down that they haven't given up. They're just waiting for me to answer again.